Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 82, the catch up. The Takeup stitches up Texas. Can you tell I've been gone for a little while, folks? All right. So I'm happy to have you guys in. It is time for the Takeup. And despite some technical difficulties getting all the streams to go live, it looks like we are here. It looks like we are live. And here is hoping that we'll be able to get the show going together and have everything working as expected. Like I said, had some issues with some of the stream going up. Here's hoping we get everything going together, but I'm happy to be back after a little bit of an extended leave as I went out to go see Impressions Fort Worth and go teach there. I had a couple of sessions, which we are going to talk about. And as I also got to go and speak for ShirtLab live out in Fort Worth, Texas. So a full week of being off teaching, training, and talking to incredible people. Incredible people. Some of them, many of them, among our usual listeners and watchers here today. So happy to say I really enjoyed seeing everybody and that we had a great time. And I'm going to talk about all of it. The first thing I'm going to say, though, before I say anything else, I am certain I will forget to mention something or somebody that was still important to me and awesome in the moment. And I want you to know that with an hour or even an hour plus bonus time, there is no way that I can encapsulate everything that happened over the course of that week and talk about everybody I met, everybody I talked to, everybody who I had meaningful conversations with. So if I miss you, believe me, it is not out of intention. I am still a little scattered. Came home after a long drive yesterday, stayed up till almost 2 a.m. both, answering things, taking care of business, and getting the show streams ready for this morning. So admittedly, I am a little scattered, a little out of my place, a little out of it. If you remind me stuff or mention something in the comments, I would be very happy to talk about any of the other events I don't say anything about while I'm here talking today. So it'll be conversational day, it'll be fun, but I actually do have a couple of little tips, a couple of nuggets and suggestions for further reading and other elements that I think will be helpful to everybody, both in kind of the embroidery world and the business world and the creativity world, all things that we do, whether we are crafters, artists, small business people, big business people, all of these things I think are valuable to us. So we're going to talk about that and certainly talk about how the shows went, how everything went at the shows, how the things were being received, and what I saw on the trade show floor in the classes, in the sessions. We'll just cover a little bit of everything. Believe me, we also do have some technical content coming up. I've gotten a lot of questions that I need to start answering. So we'll be talking about certainly some things about efficiency and digitizing. I have some discussions that we can have, some versus discussions that I think are going to be quite interesting coming up as far as settings, connectors, traveling, efficiency, colors, thread types. There's some stuff that's very interesting people have been asking about lately, and I think we'll be seeing some new posts, new discussions, and certainly some more technical work on digitizing and embroidery as we come to it. But as this was my last trip of the year and had some of my, I would say, some of my most meaningful and very intense discussions and comings together of people who I really enjoy, I wanted to go ahead and cover some of what happened in Texas and talk about it and bring you guys some nuggets of information and some inspiration and just some discussion about what it's like out there on the road to see if you are interested in hearing about it. Let's go ahead and say hello to some folks who have showed up. You know, I like to say hello to the folks who show up live. So here are the comments. First, who I got to see out there, Matt Enderley of the Embroidery Nerd himself and a patch phrase. Hey, glad to see you out here and was very happy to see you out at the show. Justin Armenta, also, who I finally got to meet. If you guys don't know, I've been blogging for a very long time, since about 2006, professionally in the industry and writing for magazines since back then. And fairly early on or earlier on, I got to talk to Justin when he was starting out his blog and really kind of coming out with that and being more proactive about content. So I've known of Justin for a very long time. We didn't meet until this Fort Worth trade show. And it was so awesome because really walked up and Justin's like, hey, it's Eric. And immediately we just started talking as if we had always known each other. So one of those cool things about knowing each other online and being aware of each other in a professional space is that once we finally did meet, it was kind of like old home night. We were just buddies and ready to talk shop just like we were across the street from each other. So Justin, great to see you in and happy to see you here at the show today. We have some other folks. Datu, hello. Happy to have you in. If I mispronounce anything, feel free to let me know. Christine Shreve, who I got to see out and have great conversation with at Impressions Fort Worth. We also both got to sit in on fantastic sessions. I don't usually go and take the sessions all the time. I'm not always there availing myself of the education, but I had some time at this show at Fort Worth. I had some time off the show floor. I wasn't running a booth. And Christine and I got to go have some education time with Jay Bissell, a friend of this show, friend of a lot of the shows, and chief taco officer himself, writer of Your Style Guide, Jay Bissell. He was out teaching about LinkedIn. So there's some cool stuff there that I may cover later on. I know that social media is part of what we do, both as, like I said, both as business people and creators, but his insights on LinkedIn were awesome. And Christine and Jay and I got to have some really great discussions after the show as well. And yeah, Matt, it was awesome re-meeting you last weekend. Absolutely awesome re-meeting you too. I mean, we got to meet briefly when you and Jeff were in one of my classes at DAX. I think it was almost 2 years ago now, but we really haven't got to hang out as much. And it was cool to get to hang out personally with you and with the rest of the Embroidery Nerd crew, which I'm going to talk about as well. And Ramona, afternoon, good to be home, isn't it? Yeah, Ramona was out with us too, doing the trade show thing. And yeah, it's good to be home, though, I have to admit. You think things are going to be on pause for that week that you're gone running the trade shows, and all of us know in business as well as in our personal lives that you leave midstream while things are going on, and that week of things that you had going on follow you. Even if you try and do work from the road, which I certainly did, wasn't enough, and I still have plenty to dig out from. So as we all know, trade shows are there, but this is something I'm going to hit on several times throughout this session. Yes, there's a lot of work that has to be done in going to trade shows and education. But one of the most sure payoffs in investment is investing in yourself. If you go out to the trade shows, you make connections with other people who are in your industry, who inspire and educate you. You go to real classes, get education from people who know different, who know better, who know what they're talking about, and put that money into your own head, into your mind, into your own edification, and you will come out ahead. There's no one who can take away from you the insights that you gain from these things. And digging back out of some difficulty at the end of this, trust me, the increases in availability and the increases in skill and technique that you will have from going out to learn this stuff, and especially when we're talking about business, we're talking about creativity and attitudes and the ability to improve our process, are such that it will absolutely be worth digging back out of the paperwork. Get out to the trade shows, or at the very least, spend some time on education for yourself. And hey, have some time with yourself to talk to yourself, take that meeting. And I was glad to see Ramona was out there, and we were connecting and networking and talking about all kinds of things, seeing what was new on the trade show floor, seeing what was new in equipment, seeing what was happening as far as our peers. And all of these things are valuable for us getting going. And Jeff is in, but it's Jeff and Adam. By the way, Adam, super happy that you liked some of the stuff we arranged for you at the show. But it was great to see Jeff was there. As you know, Jeff Fuller of Embroidery Nerd, of Furlough Embroidery Works. He was also there. And he and I, by the way, got to do an incredible session. We got to do a session with Sam over at Sam Young over at Madeira, USA, hosted this panel where he and I answered questions for about 40 odd wonderful new and old embroiderers, people who had been in the business anytime from 6 months to 15 years. And we on Saturday got to do an entire session of question and answer. And by the way, Jeff, you did fantastic. I was glad to be up there with you. And I think we really helped some people out. There were great question and answer sessions going on. What I am going to say is, what continues to be the big question, the big question for everybody whenever you're at a trade show is equipment and software and purchasing things. So if you didn't see their session last night, I unfortunately could not be on the session with the Embroidery Nerds last night, but then I know they discussed it, and I've done several videos and articles about your best buys in software and machinery and what I think you should be looking for. And no, I'm not telling you a brand. Yes, I am telling you some qualities to look for in the companies you buy from. That is certainly a big deal. And also the technical stuff. There's always questions about stabilizers. There's always questions about speed and digitizing and thread and needles. There's always those kind of questions. And I actually myself got to teach a specialty thread session that I'll discuss briefly. But yeah, Jeff and I did a session, and I don't know if those are up online. I'm going to tell you this right now. They are not on Impress U, which is Impressions Expo's education website yet. I don't see them in the premium listings. In the links list, I did give you a search term for my name, so you can see if any of my listings were up. So far, it is stuff that's been there from previous sessions with them and not the stuff from Fort Worth. So I'm not sure when that goes up. I know they were all recorded. including Jeff's session with me and including my session on Specialty Thread. They are recorded. I would check it out with impressions. And like I said, go to the links list and you'll find impressions links. So Impressions Expo. If there's someone who knows how to get you on there, that's it. I tried to see if I could register for a session today and couldn't get through. I'm not sure how the recordings are to be had there at the moment, but I know that the recordings were done. So if you're wondering about our sessions, yes, I'm sure there will be access to them, but they may be getting processed as we speak. Also, let's see, we got some other folks in. Marta is in. Hi to have you see you, Marta. Hi from Texas, she says. Margaret says hi. Hi, Margaret. And Christine, glad to get to chat with you in Fort Worth. Absolutely glad to catch up with Christine always. By the way, Tom Rowan. It's just such your name funny, my man. But Tom, one of the two principals who set up ShirtLab, had a great session talking about his kind of story and his journey at the beginning of ShirtLab to kick things off. And it was really inspirational. If you haven't seen what he's done, everything from setting Guinness records to building a business with multi-stream inputs and having, tons of ability in the decorated apparel space, but helping a lot of people sell and really get focused in on how to sell well and how to build their equity. You need to go check out stuff that Tom is doing as well. So he's got, like I said, he was one of the great inspirational speakers at ShirtLab Live at Fort Worth. And I'm going to talk more about them as we get going. Lyndon saying, glad you're safely home from Texas. I enjoyed the nerd get together. Yeah, absolutely. It was a great time. Enjoyed seeing all the nerds, and I actually have that in the links list too. So if you want to see a 2+ hours of me kind of half-heartedly producing, I guess, or producing in a weird space while we were all sitting together and talking, and me trying to continue to keep us back on the rails as I do when I produce. That happened. It was an Embroidery Nerds show, and I was just a guest in it and running the boards for no apparent reason except for the fact that I had the extra laptop. But yeah, we've got a link for that in the list as well. Frank from over in the UK. Good evening, Frank. And by the way, thank you for sharing all of the links, man. Thank you for bringing people in and having them come in to share in this discussion, this Q&A. Frank is an awesome community booster and supporter, and we all owe you, Frank. Thank you very much. Crystal says, happy Friday. We'll listen on my drive home if I lose service. Hey, listen whenever you can. Sandy saying hello. Hi, Sandy. Happy to have you in. Steve in, no envelopes this week. All right. Hello. Good to talk to you now. Let's see here. We have Letty saying, good afternoon, everybody. Letty, who had an awesome jacket. If you guys don't know, she's the one who designed the initial reciprocator icon. If you guys don't know, you're not part of the show usually. We call all the listeners reciprocators, both because it's a joke about a part in the machine that is very crucial to keeping the needles moving up and down, and because I consider you guys all reciprocators, as I hope I am. When we get things from the industry, from the people around us, we give back, we reciprocate. And because we have such a wonderful community here, I love that. But she made an awesome little reciprocator or sippy character, and she had that on her jacket. But the sippy character has nerd glasses on it, so it was the first official merch crossover, I guess, or unofficial merch crossover between us and the Embroidery Nerd. So that was super cool. Letty, happy to have you in. Ramona says, of the session, I believe me and Jeff, that session was great. Lots of good information out there from the two of you. Glad to hear that. Absolutely. And Christine also said, caught the last half of the session that you and Jeff did with Madeira. You guys did great. Glad to hear it. Brian is in, who I got to hang out with a lot more at ShirtLab, though we got to catch up previously, but hung out quite a lot with Brian during ShirtLab, and it was fantastic getting to, once again, talk shop. We talked a lot about e-commerce, not always in great terms, but hey, when you have on the floor experience with a shop and the heartache sometimes of working with e-commerce systems, you get into the trenches and you talk about the real stuff that it takes to run things out. So, one of those things that happens is we get to talking deep shop, and Brian and I got into that pretty recently. Jan is also in and says, hi, couldn't make it to Impressions. Husband was sick and we had to wait for COVID test. He was negative. So sorry I missed it. You know what? I'm sorry you had to miss it too, but glad that your husband is all right and well. So here, that's what we're talking about. And Martha says, can we get to the content, please? It makes me want to say hi to a few more people because I'm a stubborn human being, Martha, but you know what? We'll see. Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe I'll talk to five or six more people when the comments come in. You tune into the Takeup, you get us talking to all the friends as well in the lead. Sorry, Martha. It's just how it is. But let's go ahead and start talking about some of the content. But, we'll get to it as we get to it. We like to talk to everybody and have a moment with everyone before we get started. If you didn't know already, the links list is there for everybody to get into the extra content. If you want to get ahead of the game and see some of the links for stuff that's there, feel free to go ahead and do so. You'll see the links list has some interesting stuff there. It has the live show that we did with the Embroidery Nerd. So plenty of content there for everybody, over 2 hours of content going on. So you'll see us talking about how the show went down. And this is all right after, it says ISS show, but now it's Impressions Expo. I've been calling it ISS myself. But the Impressions Expo show out in Fort Worth, it is the most current one. And we talked about how the show floor went, how the distributors were doing, how the vendors were, how the classes were, and how we were, and handing out merch and all the fun stuff that went on, with plenty of inside jokes and humor to get if you were there or if you were hanging out and watching the content come through. Next couple of things that are on the links list today. You're going to see, it says it's a heat pressing thing. Once again, links list. I'm looking for a better alternative to links list that's as easy for me to manage. But this actually is a link to Impress You Online, which is the Impressions online area for classes and recordings. It does have lots of my previous sessions on it in the premium section. So if you've been looking for a previous impression session you couldn't get to, you can definitely get to it here. Other stuff that's there, links to ShirtLab Live, links to some definitions of terms we're going to talk about in the content, a couple of articles that I've got, one on mise en place for preparing your embroidery area, preparing not only your embroidery area, but the way that you're digitizing, getting your files and yourself and your art prepared before you get started. And then also there's a couple of links to one book that I thought was very interesting that I picked up from multiple speakers at ShirtLab Live. One from a certain Michael Michalko called Thinker Toys. There's a great one there. And then there's Scamper, which is a topic from that, is one of the toys, the tools, the thought tools about creativity from Thinker Toys, and it's a definition of Scamper. So these things are all things we're going to talk about, but I like to put it out in their links list so you can get to that content and be able to grab something to read or further explore if you liked any of that material. So that stuff is all there via checkout in the links list. Check that out and you'll find that also. I will drop that in the comments as well for everybody so that you can get to that later, and it's a click away, but it is up on screen if you need it. Links list, like I said, if you guys have a great replacement for links list, let me know. I would love to replace it too. It's one of those things that works okay for right now, but is not the end all be all for sharing these links. All right, so with that, folks, let's talk a little bit about Impressions Expo Fort Worth. Everybody tends to ask about, hey, how was the show floor? Was it a good show? People are always concerned about how things have been since COVID and since the pandemic has kind of changed the landscape out there. You know, what was it like? What was the show floor like? What was the showing like? And frankly, I would say of the shows I've gone to, Impressions Expo Fort Worth this year was probably the most normal, if you want to call it that. First thing I'm going to come out and say, absolutely, without a doubt, was it smaller than a normal year? Absolutely. There's no lying that the show floor had fewer people on it, fewer vendors in the mix than they usually do. Were there cancellations? Yes. There were cancellations there. There were cancellations in the educational sessions as well. However, there was a preponderance of people who still showed up. And despite the fact that there was a smaller show floor presence, what I'm going to say for sure is that there was an energy, there was a buzz. And as soon as I stepped out onto the floor, after I did my session, my first session on specialty threads was early on Friday. And during that session, you know, a smaller session, but fairly well attended, not tiny, not huge, but session went well, had some good questions, talked to people afterwards, packed up and got out to that show floor. And as soon as I hit the floor, there was that very familiar buzz, that sound of people milling about, talking to each other, getting into it with the vendors and really discussing things. And with enough people at the booths that there was activity going on, there was a bit of cross chatter, there were people talking to each other as well as talking to the vendors. And it wasn't a ghost town. We've had some times where there are parts of each show that are very thin and there aren't a lot of people. Fort Worth seemed to be pretty well attended throughout. Like I said, was it normal? No, this was not a pre-COVID trade show yet. But of the trade shows that we've seen for a while, it was, albeit smaller, well attended. And certainly everybody who went, I kept on hearing this, and I've heard this at every show. DAX shows were very much the same. If you went to the show and you talked to vendors, they spent time with you, you had attention, you had people giving you some extra care. So if you were there to look at machines, if you were there to see what was going on, there was extra care at each of the booths. And I think that people got a fairly decent ROI in that. If you spent your time to go out there, you had a chance to talk to people and get a little deeper, even if there wasn't quite the variety of booths you might expect. At this show, there were multiple machine manufacturers. We're talking about embroidery, so we did see people out there. You did see Happy's on the floor, ZSK's on the floor, Tajima's on the floor, Bairden's on the floor, Melco's on the floor. Like, there were a larger selection of machines than I've seen at some of the other shows, and certainly people were present and there. I do think that we're seeing a lot more beginners lately, and that's a good thing. At the same time, I think for some of them, if they've been hearing these stories of previous Impressions Expo shows, they probably did say, hey, this floor is fairly small. You were able to cover it in a day pretty handily. And if you weren't there with an agenda to go specifically talk to some people and get deep on machines, you could definitely browse that floor pretty quickly. However, what was really nice to see from the folks at Impressions Expo is they very much scrambled and had enough people there for education that there were sessions running throughout the day. It wasn't very thin. It wasn't a small amount of sessions. So we had awesome sessions, both from, Bill Garvin was out there talking about embroidery machines. I was out there talking about specialty thread on Friday. We had the session, like I said, talked about the session with Sam from Madeira hosting Jeff and myself, as we talked about all things embroidery from all over the spectrum. And certainly heat press from the folks at Stalls. Over and over, there were good sessions. Jay Basel's sessions on LinkedIn were fantastic. So there was everything in the realm of technical work, embroidery, your price margins, whatever it is that you wanted to see. There was something out there. There's a fair amount going on. And I think that was really kind of the interesting part of it. Certainly, there were some things out there that I would love to see more of, and I do want to return to the big shows. Everybody who's been out to the pre-COVID shows, you would love to see the shows where all of the vendors were in. And truthfully, Fort Worth, despite being kind of one of the later large shows of the year, I've seen Fort Worth repeatedly be a place where people kind of do an initial test run of stuff they're going to fully launch at Long Beach. You often see some new equipment, something really interesting there. And in fact, the first time I saw Stahl's latest heat press, or hat heat press, the 360 from Hottronics, which everybody loves and actually had a great showing at ShirtLab Live. That heat press is pretty impressive. First time I saw it, I got to see it at a media event at Fort Worth. And it was one of those things where you saw some interesting new stuff at Fort Worth, which I don't think there was quite as much of that going on, but this has been a pretty interesting year for everybody as far as supplies. And that's the other thing we heard a lot of, were people kind of complaining about suppliers. And I understand that the supply chain is definitely having some issues that is continuing on, and that discussion was going on the floor. However, multiple vendors were looking to address supply issues and provide alternatives to some of those classic blanks that we can't find, and you know which ones we're talking about. So there were at least some answers to that going on, and people were really trying to make something happen at Fort Worth, and I think they did quite a bit. So though there are some interesting things that happened that were strange and rare, and I tried to actually represent these and couldn't do it. Letty says, I miss seeing that looper machine. One of the funny thing that all of us both in the Embroidery Nerd and myself got excited about for no particularly great reason was that the folks over, I believe at Dave Stitch, had a Toyota machine that had a yarn looper. And as the person hosting that machine said, it was like 90s technology today. They only had 6 of them. They were selling them with machines, but it was making almost a very chenille-like looped finish by looping yarn with an attachment on the machine head. And the funny thing is that we were all just mesmerized by it because most of us had only ever seen it in books or in videos somewhere else, usually in books. And I know Bonnie Nielsen's Punch, if you know of Bonnie Nielsen's work, wonderful digitizer. Her book, I believe, has one of the looper feet in it. I know that's something Jeff was telling me, and I seem to remember it being there too. But it essentially loops yarn and stitches down the yarn in a looped pattern that kind of looks similar to a very heavy, very thick chenille patch. But that there was a machine running those, and despite it being old technology and not available, all of us were just mesmerized by it because it's something you don't see. There were people showing a lot of other equipment that was interesting, though. At the same time, it was like kind of like a middle of the road normal trade show, but with a lot of personal attention going on and people having deep discussions. So that was cool. Christine says, every vendor or attendee that I talked to was engaged and excited to be there. I thought there was a great energy at this show. And I have to agree. If there was a major takeaway here, is that there was a fantastic energy. There was a buzz on the floor and people were excited to see each other and were, if nothing else, they were talking like they were rebuilding. Let's put it this way. The people who were there, I didn't hear a lot of fatalistic stuff or people who were negative or talking about things they lacked, aside from, of course, the product chain stuff, which was, there was a lot of, hey, we can't get X garments, which I totally get. That is a real thing people are dealing with right now. So there's no pat answer to supply chain problems. That's happening, by the way, in every industry everywhere. The one thing you can be happy about, or at least feel consoled by in some cases, that every industry everywhere right now is having supply chain problems that are happening across the board. So you are not alone in the embroidery industry or in any industry in not being able to get the blanks you want, the garments you want. Everyone's scrambling. And so at the very least, hopefully there is some grace there when people realize that the supply chains are the same for everyone. And hence, when you have empty shelves at the box stores, it's not surprising that we sometimes have empty shelves at our vendors. But I will say, despite that, everybody seemed to be in the mood for rebuilding and for working and improving. And I think that positive kind of attitude really carried on. And I had the most of that also, by the way, ShirtLab Live Fort Worth, which I'm going to get to here shortly, absolutely heard a ton of that very positive talk of rebuilding and working on things and improving things and making the best of our situations. So happy to see that. And especially getting to see all the Embroidery Nerd folks at Fort Worth, and getting to see all of you who are listeners and watchers and having discussions and being able to actually sit down person to person was really incredible. So I have to agree absolutely, Christine, on that one. And Letty says, I think it was well represented with a lot of machines and options. Yeah. And like I said, for the size of the show, it was good to see how many people did get out. A lot of folks got out, a lot of vendors were there, and I was happy to see that there were options for everybody to see. Like I said, if there was a machine brand that you wanted to see, I would say largely they were there on the show floor. So you want to see a ZSK, it was there. If you wanted to see a Happy Machine, you want to see a Baird, and you want to see a Tajima, you want to see a Melco, they were there on the floor and something to do. And yes, I'll go ahead and call this out because it's awesome. I've done some of this before too, so I love to see this when my friends who are digitizers do this. You guys may not know, if you digitize for a while and get any sort of recognition, there will be machine vendors who want to run your designs on the show floor. I've done a couple of those, though it can be frustrating to get things set up. If you want to see some of these designs, they did have them on the floor for our own Justin Armenta, who's in the Happy booth, and Vitor of Vitor Digitizing. He was in GSG booth on the ZSKs. Those were there, so you see some great work from those guys. Certainly, I will say that some of the stuff they put out on the show floor is there to show off what embroidery can do. Might not always be the most production friendly. Even the stuff I digitize for some of those are pretty showy, but it was cool to see that work, because the creative kind of work that they're doing, especially, seeing big, impressive creative work that shows what the machines can do, that shows what specialty thread can do, that gives us an idea that embroidery is something that is of a higher value than just a flat representation. It is not just a direct one-to-one representation of a printed piece of art, a flat piece of art. It is something that in and of itself has value as a medium, which, by the way, was the topic of the session I taught at ShirtLab Live. So we're going to get to that, but I just thought I would let you guys know, as the show went on, I think that it was fairly impressive. Things went well. I do think it was a worthwhile thing to go through and see. And if you want to go and check it out, I have put links up there, but there were a lot of great sessions. If you want to contact the people over there, it is likely they have a link to get you to those recordings. But I am going to say that the recordings weren't showing up so far yet in Impress You. I did put the links up there anyway, so you can see all these different recordings are there. And there's my happy little face that you are used to seeing in the bottom corner of a video. But we had all that going on there. If you go to Impress You right now, though, which is that, like I said, Impressions Expo's educational kind of website, right now they do have like 12 sessions from me from previous sessions and online sessions I did kind of during the pandemic. So if you do sign up for Impress You, or if you're already signed up and you happen to be on that platform and you want to see some cool stuff from me, then absolutely feel free. Check that out. They do have some recordings of stuff that was previously only available at the trade shows, including some of my pricing stuff and things that haven't been done anywhere else aside from trade shows. I know people always ask, they can't get out to the impression shows. They can't get out, especially when I do all the ones at the coasts. These recordings are directly from there, and they're synced to these slideshows. So you get a recording of my voice while you're watching the slides move as I move them. So it is possible to get that stuff if you want to. A couple things I wanted to bring up, though, with Impressions Expo Fort Worth are just really quick, important lessons, little pieces of what I taught. And the big thing was I was teaching specialty threads. Aside from the question and answer, I can't give you the Q&A experience aside from if you want to ask questions right now. And I would be sub one, missing one Jeff Fuller, which maybe he and I should get on and do a video Q&A one of these days. We'll do the do that 30-minute Q&A he does, but together one of these days to give you guys a feeling for the Madeira panel. But suffice it to say, I was teaching a session on specialty threads, and I wanted to give you just a solid couple of basic tips, things that I think were interesting, things that I think are easy to take away. We've done specialty thread before and discussed it on the Takeup, so go ahead and search into the back catalog for that. However, part of what I was discussing was technical, part of it was in applying that and value. But let's just briefly talk about the digitizing for specialty threads. First, defining specialty threads. This is any thread that is not a standard 40 weight rayon or polyester. I consider pretty much everything outside of that to be specialty. If it's thicker, if it's thinner, if it has a different shine like metallics, if it is matte finish, so it has a very different sheen than that polyester, if it's fuzzy, these are things I can be special. So spun polyester, those are all specialty threads. But the primary thing most people get tripped up on specialty threads is actually fairly simple to address, and that's in the digitizing. What are the primary things we ever have to change about our digitizing for specialty threads? They usually have to do with either the thickness of the thread, somewhat with the friability, the ability to break, the fragileness of the thread, especially with some metallics. But I'm going to say the primary thing we have to change digitizing is when we're dealing with thicker or thinner threads. And it's fairly mathematical. We do have to get a feeling for how to handle these threads depending on the situation they're in, being that if you have super thin threads and you start doing super fine details and you're on a heavy knit or some other material that has a tendency to make your needle jog around or deflect, or if you're on something that's very thick or lofty that can swallow it, then you have to be careful with those fine details in that respect. But when we're talking about what we change in our file, the primary things we have to change for thick threads and thin threads, whether that is specialty fuzzy threads or not, whether it's just thick and thin threads that are standard rayons and polys, or they are thick threads that have fuzz to them or some other texture, it's density and stitch length. These are the cornerstones of just about every kind of understanding of coverage, and they should be second nature to you to question what your target densities and stitch length should be anytime you change things up. So why do we play with density and stitch length? We are either looking for full coverage or we want to adjust how much coverage we have of either the background material or other items that are or other embroidery objects underneath the current object. That's one thing we are doing with density. Or we are dealing with the fact that thicker or thinner threads are going to require us to have less space between courses, lines of thread. As we know, density is a measurement of space between lines of thread. If we have thicker threads, we're going to need more space between them so we don't stack the threads up too tightly, and we will achieve the same kind of coverage we would with our standard threads, but with less density, with more space. And if we have thinner threads, we're going to need to have less space between the courses of thread because we're laying thinner threads next to each other. And if we want full coverage, we're going to need to decrease the space in between them because the threads are physically thinner. That is really the key. And it's fairly simple. It's fairly mathematical. Certainly, a lot of the stuff I taught was more than that. I talked about best use cases for the threads, what they can achieve, what they are good for, what you should watch out for. Certainly, we're talking about things on the machine like needle sizes. We're going to have larger needles with larger eyes for threads that are thicker, and of course, smaller needles for thinner threads. This is nothing that's all that unintuitive. It's usually pretty easy to figure out. But these are the top things we change in our files. And I'm not going to go deeply into settings. It's something we've talked about before, and you can definitely go to the class for that if you want to do that as well. And you can find that on the Takeup. However, this is the cornerstone of any time we work with the specialty thread. We need to find out for the given coverage we want to achieve, how dense can we get, or how dense should we be in order to get that coverage? And that's something we can test on. However, I'll show you something else about that in a second. And stitch length, because we're using wider needles, because we have that thicker thread, and as we use larger needles, that the measurement on the needles actually describes the width of the blade of the needle. We're going to have to use longer stitch length for thicker threads. And it's something we have to watch out for. If we have super small stitch length on thick threads, we're much more likely to cause breakage and bird nesting and all of that. So density and stitch length are the top things we need to change when we deal with thicker and thinner threads. It's not, like I said, it's not controversial at all, but it's the first thing to look at. And I think that sometimes it gets lost in the discussion of the specialty techniques. I also got to teach, I showed a wonderful piece from Vitor where he did this brushed animal texture, and I described that and did a breakdown of that for people. The brushed animal textures are awesome. They're super cool. Doing brushed fuzzy threads is a very interesting look, albeit hard to launder. However, we lose in that the discussion of the basics. And in the basics, if you're using 12 weight thread that is incredibly thick, that we are going to want to increase our space between them, decrease our density, increase our space between those lines of thread quite a bit. And we're going to want to increase our stitch lengths. And conversely, when we have thinner threads, 60 weight threads around 25% thinner, generally than 40 weight thread, that's how it sews. We can then go about that much smaller as long as we've used our 65-9 needle, our smaller needle, when we're doing small text. And when we're really doing is measuring openings and the width of satin stitches, provided we can get that decent look on top of the texture of the material we're working on. You're doing a heavy cable knit sweater, teeny tiny 60 weight thread columns are kind of getting it broken up. We have to mitigate the texture of our garment when we're doing super thin details. So if there's one tip to take away from that is to mind your density and stitch length. And I'm just going to show you something very briefly. My class is not just a copy of these things. However, if you want to know what your base levels are, some of these base levels, some of these base densities are right there with your thread charts, are right there on the websites where you buy your thread. Let's say that you're talking specifically, since we were hosted by the good people at Madeira USA, I'll go ahead and show their site. But any thick thread you have in any manufacturer you had, you can contact the manufacturer. They're going to tell you, if you can't see that here, I'm just going to kind of highlight it randomly and show you. This right here tells you that on the Burma wool blend thread, which is a 12, digitizing, they want you at an average density of 9 points, and they're recommending a 116 needle. So even if you're not in a class with me and I'm teaching you the finer points of using this stuff, or even if you're not analyzing someone's design so you can see how closely together they put things, or even if you're layering multiple fills and you want to kind of see where you're at, if your target density, if the number of lines of thread ends up where you've got a spacing of about 9 embroidery points or 0.9 millimeters, you're going to have a solid full coverage. Whenever they show you this, though, that's the only thing they don't say. They're saying average 9-point density. What that means is at an average of 9 points density, we're going to get full coverage of what's underneath. If we want lighter coverage in a particular layer, then we're going to have to go more than that. We're going to have more space between that. We're going to have less density to get that done. But if you're completely lost and you don't know where to go with your densities for coverage on any thread, go check out the manufacturer website, because the likelihood is they probably have a PDF. They probably have, in fact, I know they've got PDFs on this site as well, or they have some sort of density suggestions, needle suggestions to get you started. And as much as we may feel as embroiderers, as digitizers, we have something more than the standard. And I'll agree that I do things differently than the standards that are presented here sometimes. These are good starting points from the people who are making the thread, and it wouldn't make sense for them to try and bamboozle you into bad settings. Start with these settings, and you can always make them lesser or greater if you want to see what kind of coverage you get in your specific sample and your specific test. And I also thoroughly encourage you guys to do swatch testing. You know that I've shown there were times when I regained 18% of my stitch count. Like I dropped my stitch counts by 18% by doing swatch testing and finding out exactly what density I could hit with the right underlays, and got that stuff at full coverage, or at least at coverage I was happy with in a design. And that's all done by doing swatches of different densities in the thread that I wanted to use. Swatch testing is super useful. I still recommend it, but if you're completely lost, go to the website where you're buying this thread from and take a look. They often will have densities listed and needle recommendations listed, and you could do worse than to try those out and give them a shot. So, and honestly, they also have things like, when we're talking about the Burma thread, we talked about the brush look that you do for animal fur. They have brushes and tools and all of that you can take a look at. And there's usually some spec sheets to help you learn these things. Certainly, check out my class, check out somebody else's class where they go into some details and talk about the value of these things. But if you want to check that density and stitch length out and get a base level fairly frequently, you can go there and find these things out too. The other thing I want to talk about was the sales portion of it, where I discussed why I think specialty threads are impressive and useful. And I'm going to give you one of the actual examples that I used, because I was talking about value and feeling. And this is something I touched on several times when I was discussing embroidery with not only people at Impressions Expo, but certainly at ShirtLab, where I did the entire presentation on this. Specialty threads allow us to very simply add a different value, a different sense to our embroidery without a ton of work, without a ton of extra labor, and definitely without higher stitch counts, depending on how you're doing it, unless you are using finer threads to get that finer detail. Not necessarily with higher stitch counts, not necessarily with more outlay on labor. We end up with an incredible value and a feeling, or imparting a style to our designs that we might not get any other way. So I'm actually going to show you a couple of the slides from the deck. So here's a freebie, if you want to call it that, a couple of slides of the deck talking about 12 weight fuzzy threads. And in this case, I was just kind of showing one of the ways that I think this market can be really useful. So any market where you're trying to sell something that is supposed to be handmade or soft, and that the idea is you want a soft, warm, approachable sense to the product you're working on, or you want a vintage or distressed sense. That might also be another way you can use the fuzzy threads, especially if you're going to distress them or brush them or other things like that. But handmade, soft, warm looks are easily achieved with 12-weight thread. And I'm actually going to show you a piece where I'm talking about that. This was a tag made for handmade knitted goods. So handmade knit goods, this was the initial tag. You can see on the right-hand side, it's not a bad logo. Logo looks pretty normal. It's got standard block text with kind of a interlaced motif between the C and the S. And on top and bottom, we've got straight stitch text. It says hand wash, dry flat, which are actually wash instructions, but also kind of part of the motto, the concept of this particular tag, done on a piece of canvas. Interesting way to add a branded tag to your knit garments, right? This isn't unattractive, but it's done in 40 weight polyester. I would argue, and this is my piece, I did this, so I can tear it up if I want to. I would argue that maybe it's a little anemic, a little thin in the straight stitch lettering, but I think that the shiny look of it's not bad. It's not terrible. It has some texture and that's interesting. But let's say that I wanted something that had more of a loose, more of a handmade branding. There's the same piece with almost no work on the digitizing side, rendered in 12 weight fuzzy thread. And if we look at this piece again, I think that the straight stitch text makes a lot more sense here. And in all honesty, the concept was that I was very much thinking about using straight stitch text. We just decided, or the thick thread in the straight stitch text. We just hadn't decided yet if we were going to go with that for the entire process. So I showed it both options. All that's changed on the secondary part of it in the logo, all that's changed for the 12 weight thread in this case is density. Density, and carefully checking out to make sure none of my tie-offs or anything else were going to have too many short stitches all put together, because as I said previously, we're using that big 116 needle. It's a millimeter wide. If you put a bunch of little tiny stitches next to each other, you're just begging for something to break or knot up. However, in this case, dropping my density to that 9 value is giving me all this look. And admittedly, do we have a rough edge around those satin stitches? Yes, we do. But that's the concept. As a 12-weight thread, it's huge. We know that we're going to have big penetration points. We know that we're going to have some edge quality difference. We know that we're going to see some roughness in that. And it's stitched on canvas. So we've got something that deflects needles, that has a rough edge, that has a tendency to make the thread track along it. But when the look is supposed to be handmade, when this is a tag going on a hand knit piece made of organic fibers, the concept of this looking like thick floss that was hand stitched is thoroughly worthwhile, and it changes the feel of the piece a great deal, and it adds value while decreasing stitch count. I mean, I still think, because we're dealing with a wool blend thread here, and especially when you deal with the cottons, they produce lint, they break a little easier, so there's still some difficulty in using them. You're not going to be just tearing and roaring like you would if this was polyester thread, but it does add something to the value. It does increase the value, in my opinion, and it definitely increases brand value, in that if your brand is trying to get this handmade look, this soft look, that is something that's much more easily achieved when we're dealing with that thread. So I think that's interesting. Hopefully that's something that I would, certainly put it through for you and say, this is something that's very interesting to me that I think is a valuable way to handle things. If you have the brand that makes sense for it, if you're doing something that has a folk edge, that has an ethnic edge, where you've got some sort of design that harkens back to handwork, using this thread can give you a handmade or a soft look without a tremendous amount of alteration to your technique. I mean, it's not something that's you wouldn't notice. It's not something that you would certainly think is much, much different than what you would usually do. And I think that's interesting to me, and I think that's a worthwhile thing to look at. And certainly I actually have something from Cindy, who she said that I think is certainly interesting here. Liz from GSU is pointing out, mix and match the Madeira frosted thread with regular embroidery thread for some new looks. And I'll actually go ahead and show you one more time one of my slides that many of you have seen before. And this is where I just show you how, even without changing any digitizing, with 3 threads that run at roughly the same densities, you get a vastly different look from different thread types. And if you look at the left-hand side, that is a frosted matte polyester. If you look at the middle, that is a standard stock polyester polyneon. On the right-hand side is a metallic, all in very similar color ranges. I'll say that the right-hand side is certainly cooler. It has more blue in it, but we're in a very similar color range. But look at how different these 3 pieces look, both in execution, just because there are some differences to how these different threads pull. I think that's absolutely true. The pull and stretch is slightly different among these threads. You can see that the metallic certainly was trying to pull back and lash a little bit more. But if you look at the 3 surface differences between those, it's an incredible difference in the full presentation, where we have something that's very matte finish. That's something that's going to look very flat. It's going to appear technical. It's going to appear kind of modern, or it may, depending on how you use it, can appear very vintage, because some vintage embroidery was done with like cotton threads. Or you can use spun polyester thread is another thing you can do that has a slight fuzz to it, but is roughly in the same thickness category. It's not massively thicker like that 12 weight, which is a very big difference. But you can see the sheen difference in the matte finish to the poly to the metallic. If we were trying to go for a specific look or a specific feeling, thread alone would change that quite a bit without working on digitizing. These are 3 identical. This is the same file. These 3 griffins are identically set up. There is no difference aside from changing the thread by itself. Now, I also didn't do any adjustments to make them run better. I just quite literally said, same needle, same tension, same stabilizer, 3 different threads. What do we get, without babying it, without any adjustments? And this is what we got. And I think it's worthwhile to think, hey, what kind of value could I extract by using different thread? And there's also some other values that are involved here. Let's say we were used to using rayon previously, and we start using polyester. Now it is a little more durable to abrasion. Now it holds up to industrial laundry and bleaching. Let's say we want to put something outside, and we know that it's going to catch a lot of UV. It's going to be upholstery in a boat, or it's going to go on a tire cover, or it's going to be on some sort of decor that lives partially outside or in a sunroom. On the left-hand side there, that poly, the frosted matte poly, holds up to UV quite a bit and doesn't have as much color decline. These are things that are very different as far as the way the threads behave over time. But this is one change with no digitizing change, no art change, that can change the feeling of a design immediately without any sort of input from, like I said, from a designer, from a digitizer. You can highly change the final outcome. So I think that's something that's used certainly in an interesting way, and I think that's useful to think about. And certainly, Cindy says, have you used both threads in the same design? Absolutely, I have. I've even played with doing a gradient from matte to shiny. The thing is, I think that it's not as visible as you think it is in the same color range, or at least it wasn't. I didn't think that people would get it as impressive. For embroidery nerds like us, we might get it. We might like the idea of going matte to poly to shiny. And by the way, Matthew says, you keep saying my name. Yes, it's M-A-T-T-E, matte finish, not a matte finish. But hey, if he finishes his work, I suppose it's a matte finish too. There's the dad joke that I would never say, but here you go. But yeah, Cindy, I have used both threads in the same design. I think what's interesting about that is also the matte stuff tends to go back in the picture plane, kind of recede, whereas the shiny stuff picks up the shine. What's also interesting is to have a field of color, and then tonally in the same color, I like putting a shiny element in the middle of a field of matte thread, because I think it's cool to see the contrast. Also, you want a super deep, dark shadow. A dark matte finish thread next to a shiny element in poly is kind of a cool look too, because it really does sink in and absorb a lot of light. I mean, that's what matte finishes do. They don't reflect as much light. So yes, both threads in the same design, have done so for my own tests, but I don't have anything up to show right now. And that may be something I need to do. Because that's something, like I said, I played with some gradient stuff. I've played with using them as shadows. And I think it's interesting, but it's not something I see a lot of folks doing. I've also been using a little bit more of spun polyester thread. It's more similar to what you'd see in like serger thread or sewing thread, where it has a little bit of fuzz, but it's not super thick. And that's interesting as well. I may well have some samples of that as well to show. In fact, I think I've shown you guys some of the spun poly stuff. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and bring up a couple more slides just to show it to you briefly. On the left-hand side is one done by Jeremy Picker, and that's made of spun polyester thread. This one is also spun polyester, so the thickness is not vastly different from embroidery thread, but as you can see, there's just a little bit of fuzz. It is a little bit more of a matte finish. It is not quite as reflective, and especially in the case of this one where it's washed with the garment, you can see that there's definitely some fuzz, and it does not stand up in the same way as, you know, rayons or polys do. And if you look at on the right-hand side there, what you're seeing from the top to the bottom, the top is a standard rayon thread. It might be a poly thread. I believe this might be poly neon, or I can't remember if this is the rayon of the poly neon off the top of my head. But standard finished thread with the high sheen that we are used to in embroidery. The middle range is a matte finish thread, and you can see just how dull that is. It really is quite dull. And then if we look down at the bottom, you're seeing a spun polyester thread. It has a little bit of shine. This particular spun poly doesn't have quite that much fuzz. And because I threw it on a piece of felt, I think the felt kind of stole its thunder with the way that it was fuzzy. When washed, it would probably look a little bit more like what you're seeing on the left-hand side in this Denver design from, like I said, from Picker, from Jeremy Picker and his cool stuff that he's done. But if you see on the right-hand side, that's how much different. Once again, those are the same files. Top to bottom, same file, just changing my thread type. And here's one other thing for digitizing I'd like you guys to think about. There are certain things we can do, especially with single color elements with text, that don't take a lot of extra effort on our side, but absolutely change the look. If we're looking from the left to right on each set of those R's, these are the same vector. The R's are the same vector, right? There is differences between the left, middle, and right. Those are not just the thread that's changing that. But it is 3 settings, right? All that we're changing are 3 settings per for each of those. What we're doing is multiple passes on the satin, so either whip stitch or multi-satin. I believe it's 3 and 5, like 3 passes in the center and then 5 passes on the right. And density. So we're changing the density. So we actually have the same stitch count in each one of those R's. I adjusted it till we got to the similar coverage overall, similar stitch count. But as you know, each horizontal or each perpendicular pass on the satins is tripled or done 5 times instead of being done once, which is what we're used to in the satin stitch. That's what's on the left-hand side. Like I said, in the center, I believe it was 3. On the right, I believe it was 5 passes on each one of those lines. So the stitches line right up on top of each other. And we've changed those 2 things, and we're changing the percentage of jaggedness or feathering, depending on your software, what it's called, on the edges. So from the same standard vectors, the same shapes that are in the R on the left-hand side, with changes in 3 of the standard settings on the letters, we're getting that really distressed kind of cool floss look on the right-hand side, and we haven't changed what we drew at all. Those are just settings in the software that we're playing with to get a different look. So we can have everything from a super clean look to a super rough distressed look, and we're changing 3 sliders in our software. We're changing 3 digits, not doing any more work to get that done. So think about that. There are ways we can do things both with specialty threads and with minor alterations in our digitizing that change the value, that change the way things look. So that was the big session that I got to host. Like I said, I would love to tell you more about the Q&A session. I can't tell you what was said there aside from, like I said, machines came up, sourcing came up, digitizing came up, stabilizer came up. I wish I had a recording to hand over for you, but I don't. I will say that Jeff was awesome. I think I did all right, as I usually do. Do okay, and we had a good time. So with that, I'm going to go into the second session, the kind of second thing that I got to go do and see. And that was ShirtLab Live in Fort Worth. And this was really cool. ShirtLab Live really focuses more on business and selling. But as part of that, let me straighten myself up here so you can see me above the lower banner here. As part of that, though, I actually presented a piece on embroidery that was essentially all about not selling embroidery as a commodity. It was called Selling Embroidery Beyond Stitch Counts and Commodities. And that's something that we got to talk about quite a lot, is the value of embroidery and what are unique propositions for value embroidery, what it is about our medium that's impressive. And part of the stuff that I talked about certainly was the dimensionality of embroidery. You guys have heard me say that I think embroidery is sculpture, like bas relief sculpture, if you need to look up that topic. I think certainly we've talked about it before. That's why we talk about separating things into discrete elements, carving, altering the strokes so that we have multiple strokes in a letter so that the satin stitches have the directionality. The different stitch angles create different reflections of light. Contrast between fill stitches, between roughness and randomness in fill stitches versus regular stitches. So there's an organicness to a rough fill stitch versus a regular fill stitch. These techniques, the things we do to create textural value, are part of what I think is impressive and unique about machine embroidery. And I think that's something that, in fact, I'm going to tell you right now, it's not something I think. The feedback from truthfully, the very esteemed people who I got to see at ShirtLab, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and them. There are people who are absolutely thought leaders at ShirtLab. People who are, and I'll say this, mostly in the screen printing world, mostly in the print world. These are not chiefly embroiderers. And I think that I was very honored and was lucky to be included as maybe one of the first embroidery voices that kind of made it into this realm, into the realm of learning more about this improvement, this self-improvement, this value, sales, and proposition that they are working toward. They're trying to get people to be able to sell more, but it also is about value and improvement of yourself and of your business in a really interesting way and in a creative way. There's a lot of talk about creativity as well. But what I heard back from these very esteemed people and shop owners alike who were attending, and also the educators, the people who were teaching, the people who were speaking, was that they hadn't heard embroidery spoken of in the way I did. And they hadn't heard embroidery's value, its unique value, being touted in the way that I did. And certainly I take the credit I take for that is in that I am able to produce a speech that got to some people. I think that's the one bit of credit I take. I think we were all there in spirit because I know you folks get it. And I know that if you're here right now and you're somebody who's been following for a while, you understand that embroidery is a transformative art. It's an interpretive art. We take what is given to us, and if we are doing our best job as digitizers and embroiderers, we take the art that's given to us and we create something that is the best result in embroidery that it can be, that uses the medium of embroidery to create something more than what we were given. I know you guys get that, and I think that's the thing. I felt like you were there in spirit with me. What I will say is, I heard back some things that at first started to make my heart drop. The first thing that somebody said was, they would say, "Oh, you did a great presentation." And I thought, okay, you're being kind, because you know me, I don't take that. I always feel like maybe I'm not doing that great. People are being nice. But first thing was, and this was actually, I won't tell tales at school and say who it was who said each thing, but I heard from some people who I very much respect in the industry, and we can trade names some other time. Someone who was very, very much respected in the screen print industry, industry veteran and top voice, said, I saw there was going to be an embroidery session, and the first thing I kind of thought was, embroidery. Because for these printers, for these artists and creative people and business people, they haven't really seen embroidery presented outside of some of the stuff that, yes, we do. Technical discussions about hooping and stabilizers and densities and how we handle things. They've seen that. They've seen the trade show discussions of how do we make small lettering happen. What they hadn't seen is somebody both arguing for and supporting the value, the unique value of embroidery, what it offers to the market, what its aesthetic values are, what its actual values, the things that we materially can provide are, and why we have a unique selling proposition that should make our embroidery worth more. And that it is not just the amount of stitches we put into something, the amount of time we put into something that creates value, that we can create value that is unique to embroidery that is worth more to a customer than the equal in a digital print. But he said he saw my session coming up and he thought, embroidery, I don't know about this. But he had never heard someone speak about embroidery with this much passion. And he had never seen someone discuss the textural nature of embroidery, the way that it is sculptural, the way that it is dimensional, how we can create texture and visual interest with embroidery, and that our goal as embroiderers is to do something that is interpretive and transformative, and that we make something that is better, something that is more, that has more visual impact than the flat image that we're given. And honestly, when I hear that back, I can always, I can pat myself on the back and say, Eric, you did a great job, whatever. Everybody's telling you did this incredible thing. What I think was I was lucky enough to make enough of impression that I was brought onto the stage. And it was a stage, and I'll talk about that in a second. And that I was there to embody what we know as digitizers, embroiderers, fiber artists, as people who work in this medium. Things that we know. I was glad to, at the very least, be the vanguard, or, be able to pick up the banner, pick up the flag and say, this is what embroidery is. This is why it's not just the old fashioned cousin of digital decoration or of screen printing. This is why embroidery is valuable in and of itself, and is worth money to our customers, and is worth paying attention to, and is worth treating like an actual artistic movement. It's worth treating like something that adds additional value to products that we can use to position ourselves, that we can use to enrich ourselves and our businesses, and express things that are unique, express visual impact that is unique to the medium, that is better, that is more, that is transformative, that it coordinates with print, but is its own thing. And that our goal as embroiderers should be making the best embroidery we can, not just reproducing the art that we're handed. And that's how we get ahead with embroidery. That's how we make it valuable. That's how we make the argument for what we are worth, what our work is worth in the industry and out. And I think I am, like I said, I am uniquely honored that I got to do that for these people, for people who were, like I said, if there were such a thing as screen printing royalty, if you want to call it that, there were members of that royal family in the house and in the audience. And by the way, it was a little bit cowing if you knew who it was. If you knew all the people who were there. For someone who has an awareness of that, I worked in a multi-decoration shop. I know who these folks are. I respect their opinions as both business leaders and thought leaders and creative people. That was pretty impressive. And also, it was a little scary to get up onto the stage, to be in the pit, and to be there with the bleachers all around you, with the seats all around you and the lights in your face, and stand up for what it is that you do. And I'm glad to say, with you folks there with me in spirit and buoying up my ability to do so, stood my ground, and I fought for embroidery and said why I think it's important and why I think that we belong both in this modern world of individual decoration, which, by the way, we have been personalizers and individual decorators since before anyone thought about digital tool chains and e-commerce that gets us there. We've been putting names over pockets forever. We do individual decoration all the time. In fact, that's one of the ways that I handled the initial onrush of one at a time pieces that came from e-commerce in my businesses, was to set up single head embroidery to do that job. Set up embroidery as an answer to digital order taking. But in it, being able to fight for embroidery as having its place in this modern chain, as being forward thinking, as having the ability to provide additional value in a world where we're trying to get past commoditized value, where all we are thousands of stitches, and get to a place where we have perceived value, where our customers look at a thing and in and of themselves decide, here is a product that has a luxury appeal that looks like something more that I prefer and find to be worth more than just reproducing it flat as a digital print. And like I said, nothing against digital print. Part of my whole strategy was also to talk about how we pair so well with digital print by allowing us to have full color renditions plus the texture of embroidery together with multimedia. It's fantastic. But it was cool to be able to stand on the stage and do that. And I think that was very worthwhile. And whatever it is that I managed to do, I will say you were all with me, and I was thinking of your work. I have seen incredible work throughout the years. I like to think I've produced a little good work. I've seen your work and what you're doing. And it was just like when I was talking about the great work I saw on the floor. Justin had his work and Vitor had his work, and seeing the stuff that Jeff's been putting out when you guys are doing your contests and textures, you're working on the edge of showing why embroidery in and of itself is an art form that has a method of mark making and texture that is not the same as other stuff that's out there and that has its own unique value. And so I'm applauding you guys as well when I say this stuff. When I fight for the value of embroidery, I'm fighting for what all of us are doing and why what we do and the time we spend on it and the work we do is worth more than a count of thousands of stitches. It's worth more than, and it's damn sure worth more than $1 per thousand. And pardon my French, but worth the dirty words once in a while to just say, hey, for damn sure, it's worth more than $1 a thousand. And that same $1 a thousand from 30 years ago doesn't go today. And if you're putting that extra value into it, if you are making a sculptural piece, if you are talking to a customer and finding out how embroidery's specific nature can aid them, whether that is in showing something about their particular art or their company that they want to elicit a feeling or a sensation that we can only give through the tactile and textural nature of embroidery, whether that is durability and you're showing them that either using polyester or some other specialty thread will go further than a print could ever do because thread lasts as long as the garment, whether we are showing them safety because we can give them a fire resistant thread that linemen and firefighters can use without being worried about it melting to them as long as they have the right garments and we use the right materials, our decoration will not cause problems with their safety. And we are showing them that we care. The care, quality, and consideration that we put into our work, whether that's in our art interpretation, whether that's our selection of our materials, or that is in the way that we put together our packages and help them sell that value or increase perceived value for the end user, the people who buy from our customers sometimes. Care, quality, and consideration is something that we show through our interpretation, through our taking people seriously, through our looking at someone's corporate culture and saying, how does embroidery specifically answer their problems and their questions? How do we answer their problems and their questions? How does embroidery make the difference? And ultimately, how do we? Why us? Why us specifically as embroiderers? Why our shops as people who run shops? Why embroidery rather than some other material, rather than some other media or technique? Why our interpretation? We ask those questions. We have our answers for that. And I actually went through the process of trying to give some of those answers. So ShirtLab Live in Fort Worth, I'm going to say, also, I learned a tremendous amount. From the inspirational stories from Tom, from Marshall's discussion of Scamper. It's a technique I'm going to talk about in a minute, and creativity. I mean, seriously, Richard Grease talking about his entire growth. And I'm going to talk briefly about Kaizen, which is a way of improvement that we should look at. Started out as a industrial method of trying to improve your methods, and got to hear some of that from Richard Greaves and got to talk to Richard Greaves. Awesome guy. Mark Coudray, who talked about, he covered a lot too. And honestly, he talked about creativity as well in his sessions. And he talked about new ways of looking at value and how we're charging for things, which was really cool. And what we should look at as far as trying to figure out our pricing and our value. Everybody, there were so many people. I'm going to miss people for sure. Brittany talking about email marketing, which I'm going to be implementing myself as soon as I can get a chance to do so. There was a ton. And of course, Jeffrey Gittimer, self-crowned king of sales, but somebody who did have a lot to say about sales, creativity, and life. So there was just a wealth of information in that room. And then needless to say, all of the individual shop owners, and I'm not going to name all of you guys in case you don't necessarily want to talk about all the things that I talked about being part of what we discussed. But I had some people come up and say, you know what? I really love embroidery too, even though I also do print. Here, I love you talking about the value of embroidery. And then I had people showing me their own work and saying, see, here's this texture, and this is why I thought it was important. And this guy loved this piece and sold it. And when I came to them with use cases where I said, here's a use case where this company loved the specific nature of embroidery that I brought out for their piece, and it resulted in more orders, it resulted in more value, people took note. And since then, I've been fielding quite a few emails and contacts from people saying, hey, can I get a look at your slides again? Can you talk to me or a couple principals in my company about what you said about embroidery and value? Can we have a discussion about your session? I've been talking to a lot of people since my session who really, and this was said to me multiple times, that they didn't have this thought about embroidery, that they didn't think of it in the way that I presented it. But I think it's the way that we feel about it here in this area here and the Takeup here among the reciprocators, also with the Embroidery Nerds who were present, who I got to hang out with in Fort Worth. I think we get it. We're on this level. If you're here with me right now, you're on this level. And I like to think you guys were there with me in spirit when I definitely had to get over my nerves to speak on stage. So I think that was, that's the long and the short of it. I'm going to show you some other fun stuff about it and talk about the other tips that I picked up. Because, I think what's really impressive for me this time around is that I got to go learn. I don't always have a chance to do that. The smaller shows, admittedly, are a little harder on the attendees. For those of us who are educators, because I wasn't running a booth like I was in years previous, because I wasn't having quite as many vendor meetings or people who I needed to see while I was out there, the smaller show meant that I also got to go take some sessions with other educators and my own peers, people who I know. Like Jay Bissell is a friend of mine I've known for some time. I met repeatedly. And I mean, maybe saying friend, I'm probably stretching a little bit because we don't know each other that well, but I consider Jay my friend, and I really have friendly feelings toward him. And apparently willing to ask him embarrassing questions and stuff in his sessions and ask him to do stuff. But suffice it to say, even though we're friends, getting to benefit from his actual class, his put together learning in his notes and understanding what he knows and getting to actually attend to that as a recipient, as a class taker was awesome. And then at ShirtLab, just letting it wash over you. I'm going to have to go back to those sessions and watch again. And I know there's also, by the way, if you want to see that session or any of the other excellent sessions there, I know they have recordings. I don't know what the long-term plans are for the recordings, but they did have a live stream session. That's the other thing I forgot about, that this being live streamed, because then I was getting emails from people who were not on site. I forgot about the viewers who were watching it on the stream. I completely forgot about them. I mean, that was enough to think about the people in the room. But I got a lot of contact from that. So I know that the people there, they had a whole multimedia team. There's a lot of pictures, lots of recording going on and cameras all over. So I know that was also recorded. If you wanted to see those sessions, go check the folks out. There's a link for ShirtLab Live Fort Worth. So I know that's going on. But yeah, letting all of those other speakers wash over me and learning about factory processes, about and honestly, about all kinds of things, about email marketing, about Facebook marketing, about creativity, about, like I said, Kaizen, about improving yourself, about having a 20-year plan, things that you don't think about, having that long-term goal, understanding the way you grew up and the input you have from your very unique, what I want to call, like, if you talk about a wine, I know this is a weird kind of upper crust kind of way of talking about this, but this is something I don't know. I'm not a wine guy, but what I do know is that part of what makes a wine what it is the place where the grapes are growing, right? The terroir, if you will, the territory, the environment in which something grows. And that's all of us. And I'm from a humble background. I'm not from any kind of particular, elevated background. I've gotten some education, went to a state school and I learned a lot and I read a lot, but I didn't, I'm not from incredibly rich stock. But what I will say is I have my own experiences that play into what I am and who I am now. And all of us do. And that is part of what makes us interesting and what makes all of our opinions valuable when we come to the table to have these discussions, to meet with each other, hey, to sit around and have a 2-hour live streaming session with the nerds. We all come with our own terroir, our own origin stories, our own hero's journey that got us where we are. And we have something that we brought back from those places to which we journeyed. And we have information that is valuable to other people that we can bring back to the community. Suffice it to say, it was very interesting to do. It was something worthwhile, and to listen to all of that and absorb all of that certainly creatively juiced me up. I needed that too, and it was great to be an attendee as well as to be a speaker. Though I will fully admit, of all the shows that I've done recently, ShirtLab Fort Worth, I was the most nervous. I had to deal with the most stuff and had some misfires as well as successes, but had some very gracious people who allowed me to be me and be vulnerable and deal with that. And to honestly come out and do a speech where what everybody universally said when I explained that I was nervous was that you couldn't tell. And so glad that presentation Eric showed up to take over the stage. When I look at the pictures of myself, what I do remember was when I was talking about the stuff I believed in, when I was talking about the stuff that I felt strongly about, I was happy to talk about it and I was excited to show what we had to share. And honestly, I was excited to be, if this is what I am, the token embroidery guy in the room, because I was glad that we had a voice in that room, especially because that room is full of people who I consider to be important and creative people who shape what we think about the industry. And by the way, I also fought tooth and nail for everybody from the craft scene to the prosumers to the craft show table. I fought for your professionalism too, because I believe it's there. And I'm going to tell you, the vendors understand that you're there and are making things for you. And if the vendors get it and we get it and we keep on upping our game creatively and in our professionalism and in charging what we are worth and providing excellent value, we have a seat at that table. Whether we are small producers, medium producers, or large contract producers, we're there. We're at the table. And by the way, thank you. I can't, this is more than I can take, but thank you, Brian. Brian Bailey says, embroidery could hope for no finer spokesperson. Thank you. I hope so. Embroidery has given me a lot in my life, and I want to give what I can back while I'm here. It's the best I can do. Aaron says, yeah, welcome home. Yeah, it's a lot of driving. I drove out from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Fort Worth and back, and everybody was just worried that I was texting from the road. I assure you, any posting that I did were at my infrequent stops along the road, though I let myself have a 2-day drive back so I could stop and smell the roads a little bit, walk around in Texas a minute, and at least be able to post on the way and not drive myself crazy into the sunset all night. Let's talk a little bit about ShirtLab and some of the cool stuff I learned there. First thing, I'll just show you the ShirtLab stuff. I'm going to go ahead and bring down the banner since we are looking at some images here. These are from previous ShirtLabs. It was interesting. As you can see, lots of cool people were there. And I was honored to be in this group with all these cool people. I mean, wow, it was an incredible slate of speakers. You can see there's Tom and Marshall, and I mean, a lot of people you guys know, and there's Richard, and there's, Mark Dre and Jeffrey Gittimer, and Brittany was there, and Michelle Moxley was there talking about specialty screen printing and stuff to do the digital squeegee. People that you know and who you have heard of were all there, but there was certainly quite a few people. And like I said, there's a virtual session as well as the live session you could go to. Of course, I was there in living color live, and I know that there's still some recording stuff going on. Really cool location, the art center, community art center, and we were literally in kind of a amphitheater-like theater in the round. So that there's some kind of poetic justice to the fact that I was up there philosophizing in an amphitheater. I feel kind of fancy these days. I feel a little bit like I was out there trying to make the argument for embroidery's existence, but I know that we don't need to. Embroidery's been around forever, but I'm glad that I got to at least give us our case. And as you guys can see, I was the 2:00 on that Monday was me, and we did a cool little dinner gathering afterwards. It was awesome, and like you say, Ken was the master of ceremonies. So Ken, you guys may know as well because he's in the industry sometimes. Tom, Jason had to bow out unfortunately for some family stuff, but yeah, Jonathan was here talking about becoming a broker instead of just being a printer. He was talking about what it was like to move into being a broker and selling print instead of being in a print shop. Brittany was here talking about email marketing and some great stuff going on. Marshall talked about the Scamper method, generating ideas, which I'm going to talk about briefly. Michelle Moxley talked about digital squeegee. If you guys don't know what that is, it's a combination of digital printing with traditional screen print. Really cool stuff, some special effects that you just have to see. Richard was talking about growth culture. And like I said, his whole concept of, like I said, Kaizen, which I'm going to talk about, and his kind of coming from his history and understanding this 20-year growth cycle that he learned as a landscape engineer, what that meant to have a long-term growth cycle and what it means to have that going on. There's more to it than that, but for some reason that really stuck with me, this concept. Mark talking about the physics of profit, where he was breaking down profitability into essentially laws of physics and bringing it together as how physical laws and the way profit works and momentum and things like that, how that comes together. Really interesting stuff there. Mark always is over and above thinking highly into another dimension of what we can do. And then Jeffrey Gittimer talking about sales. And if you don't know, he's got like the best selling sales book in the world. So Jeffrey really had a lot to say about sales and being yourself and what you bring to things and having, honestly, I'm going to say the chutzpah, but Jeffrey doesn't use the word chutzpah when he says what we need to sell and be out there and put ourselves out there. But chutzpah is a nice way of putting what Jeffrey said. But he definitely was out there giving us all that energy and doing some other teaching. So it's cool stuff. But here's what I'm going to show you. Number one, just to tell you how I felt about it. And yeah, Ramona says this, and this is true. She's like, it looked like a TED Talk stage. it is absolutely set up in that kind of way. This is more of the space that we're in. Whereas I'm used to the classic kind of, hey, we're in a conference room with a table at it, with a lectern or a podium, or I'm in front of some place I'm standing on the same floor as you all are teaching in the room. In this particular case, this is what you were looking at for most of the time. We were mostly socially distanced, or at least there was a potential for that. We had a larger space than we needed. But as you can see, we are definitely in an amphitheater style setup. There is what they call a confidence monitor at your feet. So you can see your slides at your feet there. That little monitor is there to help you if you need to look at your slides and if you need to see anything off of them. However, you are definitely standing out there in the lights. You walk in from the wings as if you were going on stage for anything else. And I have to admit, I had not taught in this fashion before quite the same way. So this was an interesting thing. And this actually doesn't look as deep. The way that we're looking down into this thing, and this is Tom who's on stage right now. And he talked about prospecting and where to find sales prospects. And he was really on the bead with the idea of participating in a niche, going to places where people you want to sell to hang out and hanging out there, not just trying to be in the niche of other decorators. You know, if you're working in construction, go listen to a construction podcast and comment there, and then you'll make contacts with construction people. So he had some just common sense ideas, but ideas that people don't think about with building social followings. Anyway, you're looking down at Tom speaking here, and let me tell you, from the top down, the angle is quite steep. Getting down these stairs is steep, and the look of this thing is intimidating. It very much is a stage, and you are very much in an amphitheater. So when I first saw his first picture of it, and I had not known this, I thought we would be doing standard. We are in a room. We are not in a theater. We would be having tables around. And actually, what I've heard was previous ShirtLab lives, the ones that I had seen pictures of, were more like that. They were less stage-like as they were, and some of them were more cinema stage style, but this one was very much TED Talk, amphitheater seating. This is the lighting was like that. And when I first saw his pictures when they were setting up, and then when I walked in and saw the amphitheater, I had to take a minute and take a breath, because I'm like, this is very different from any of the rooms at Impressions, any of the rooms at Dax where I've taught before. And I had to stop myself and go, all right, you know what? You're going to just present it. You're going to do your best work. And hey, you can only bomb for an hour. You can only bomb for an hour if you go up there. But I believed in what I was talking about. And, slides, I had too many slides to some people's judgment, I think. But at the same time, there were so many people who came up to say that they were either impressed with the piece or they understood embroidery better or wanted to know more. And I had I had a ton of deep discussions about embroidery after the presentation that I feel like I got the point across. However, when I saw this stage, I was definitely having a moment of hey, I got to make sure I'm on point for this. So this is the first day before everything's going on. In fact, I don't think you can see me in the audience, but I'm over here on the left-hand side somewhere watching Tom as this is going on. This is not my picture. So this is probably, I don't know if it was one of Marshall's. We had a big shared folder where there's a bunch of stuff going on. And what you can see is there was a real green room. So I'm very happy there was a green room. So while Justin was on presenting, I could hear some of Justin's presentation. It was really cool to hear him discuss being a broker. But part of what was going on, actually, you can see in this image, there's the speaker right here, and this is a view of the stage. So you can see what's going on the stage. You can hear speakers that have the sound from the stage piped into the green room. I hadn't done a real green room before, so that was super cool. I showed everybody, hey, look, green room status. I'm backstage waiting to get on. And so this was me. Did I go over my slides in the green room before we started? 100% I did. We were right after lunch, and I tied up lunch early, ran back over there, and I sat down in the green room, got myself a power plug, and looked at my slides one more time, because I was like, you know what? I want to come out of the gate strong. I want to make sure I know what I'm doing. Had my itinerary there, had my phone out. I definitely knew what time it was, and I was ready to rock once we got it going. But it's something that I absolutely wanted to make sure I was ready for. And then I'll just go ahead and give you a couple more pictures. This is from Marshall Atkinson, one of the organizers. And this is me, myself, between the curtains on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side of the stage, waiting in the wings. As they say, this is literally waiting in the wings off the stage. That's what it means, and that's what I was doing. This is me about to be introduced by Ken. So Ken Seidel's about to bring me on stage. And as you can see right there's my confidence monitor down there with my my title on there, at least with my name. And it says, Eric Campbell, Bright and Leap, as you know. So I got to go out there and represent also Bright, Leap, and Brilliance. And that was cool. because I got to introduce myself to more people, and the interest in what we were doing, and especially our recent release in Merrily, was really cool. I got to talk to a bunch of people who are larger producers about what their kind of headaches were with patches, and that was fun as well. It was cool to talk shop. Love talking shop. And so, and there I was. And like I said, I was so nervous and just tearing myself up, and I was worried and looking over my slides and everything else. But as you can see, as shocked as I was when I saw the pictures back, I think it's pretty obvious to see. If you zoom in over here, I'm smiling. And I think that's embroidery. This is something I believe in. I believe in you guys. I believe in us as producers. I believe in our art. I believe in our medium. And once you're talking about something you believe, it certainly makes a difference to how you feel. So I was definitely smiling and feeling it once I got up there, but admittedly, plenty of nerves on the way. But suffice to say, and there I am talking about measurable and perceived value of embroidery and what it is that we do to increase our value so that we get what we should get from our output. And that was pretty cool. But yeah, ShirtLab, without going over all of it, it was pretty crazy. Lots of great stuff going on. They had some excellent merch. I got to see all that stuff. All these awesome decorators, had some gatherings, got to talk about, like I said, talk shop, meet people, get together, learned quite a lot, and got to see like the new heat presses in action, got to talk about what everybody's doing in their individual shops, how everyone survived through COVID. And like I said, see all of these great presentations and just fantastic stuff. So with that, I'd like to get into the measurable tips, the stuff we can take away from it that I think are useful to you, not just all the fun and lunches and watching me on stage, but the other cool stuff that happened that I think are useful things I learned from being in the courses. And one of the first ones I'd like to discuss, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'll pop this down because I don't think it's very useful to look at it as a definition up here. But one of the things that was interesting to me was Kaizen, which is something I had heard before, but it just is something to be brought back for you. Kaizen is something that I believe started in Toyota manufacturing in Japan. And the concept, what it roughly stands for, at least what it ends up being translated as, it's kind of like change for the good, change for the better. But Kaizen as a philosophy centers somewhat around, and I'm making this less than it is. I'm trying to simplify this so I don't go on forever about Kaizen. But Kaizen is incremental change for the better. And part of the principles of Kaizen include not leaning on the way things have always been done, but looking for that incremental change, teamwork, taking feedback from people who are on your team or around you, and working with that feedback and letting that open feedback be part of what you work on. And there's, like I said, there's a lot more to Kaizen, and you'll see it all over the place. In the links list, I gave you the standard Wikipedia definition so you can see the history of the terminology and what have you involved with it. But it's all about making things more efficient, eliminating waste, and looking for small improvements, small incremental improvements. So the thing that I'm going to harp on for us, aside from the rest of Kaizen, this is something that I'm going to say in the realm of embroidery and digitizing, where do I think that it was super valuable to us, or something that's just applicable to us about the entire idea of Kaizen. Now, I'm not doing it correctly. I'm not going to tell you that I'm not a lean manager. I'm not somebody who's going to give you the perfect business definition of Kaizen, but I just want to harp a little bit on incremental improvement. I think lots of us want to look at what we're doing, either in digitizing, especially when we start, or in embroidery, in something that we are trying to do, and we try to improve everything all at once and beat it into the ground and be correct or immediately right about what we're doing from moment one. Instead of realizing that the process is, as Mr. Richard Greaves, who brought this up, says, this is like the 20-year process when you're putting together a landscape and you're planting trees. You're thinking about what this entire place is going to look like in 20 years. You can't be thinking about the 3 months. You have to think about the longer game. And the funny thing is, no matter what session I was in, long-term thinking, abundance mentality thinking, where you assume that if you are doing things correctly and you keep on working, you will have a chance to make it right, but we have to keep that improvement going and that it is going to be a process, was coming up over and over and over again. But this idea of incremental improvement, improve one thing, but do it with consistency. Improve a little bit every day, improve a little bit every time we go out of the gate, every time we hit our at bat. But then also know that that improvement is going to keep happening, and know that we're not going to stay with that previous improvement forever at the level that we were at forever, and don't hold on too much. Continue to iterate, continue to improve, continue to do the best work you can. But rather than obsess about it, when the failures happen, when the difficulties happen, make the improvement in response to those, take those failures as helpful data points and make the incremental improvement and just continue. The continuation is the goal. The improvement is the goal, not the object we've improved. We want to keep improving, keep working toward our goal of being, being masters, being great at what we do. But even as masters, we should always be looking toward what is still there to be improved, what is there incrementally, what small improvements can we do to make things a little bit better. And hey, for us, that might be artistically, aesthetically, it might be efficiency based, it might be in the way we handle our materials, it might be in eliminating waste, it might be in doing our work faster, and it might be in better representing ourselves and our medium so that we present our value correctly to our customers. Whatever it is we're doing, look toward incremental improvement and don't obsess over finishing the race before we've taken our first step. Hard for us all to do. I know I'm certainly poor at it as well, but that concept of allowing something to grow was interesting in and of itself and worthwhile. And that's absolutely how it is. And actually, Brian Bailey absolutely brings this up. This is Kaizen, absolutely. Continuous and inclusive of the team. That's Kaizen. That's how this was set up. So when you have a team, when you have your team, that you're inclusive of them and that you listen to that feedback, and that's part of how that works, and all the improvement keeps continuing, keeps going, and it is incremental. It's and actually I'm going to go ahead and call out something that Brian told me, and I actually have it written on a board up here because I thought it was so useful, and I just called it like the mug theory here. Modest usable gains. Look for modest usable gains, and I think that is his theory. And I don't know, he may tell me that that's from something else, but I always attribute it directly to Brian. Modest usable gains. It's something worth looking at. So get your mug, get your modest usable gains, and work with it. Oh, it's coin. There we go. Right, mug it. Coinbite GE's Jack Welch. Thank you, Brian. Like I said, Brian, who business and creativity, he knows these things very well. But yeah, so Coinbite GE's Jack Welch. But yeah, the mug, modest usable gains. I think that's right along the same feeling as Kaizen. Of that continuous improvement, of making little things better. But I think, as much as this is an emotional take on it, I think this is what I actually encounter. When I'm dealing with embroiderers and digitizers, I often encounter emotional resistance and problems that they're having with working on their work. And that emotional resistance is partially rooted in the fact that they expect to get perfect on day one. They expect not to have to do test stitching. They expect that every time they learn something, they'll never have to touch it again or improve it or change it, or that they won't fail. The reality is, all of us, including those of us who are experts, absolutely fail. Absolutely have difficulties. And if we're stretching ourselves, we're going to make multiple iterations of a thing and keep improving on it. And the absolute likelihood, and let's say this, even if we think the first is perfect, I'd say the first thing I wanted to say is that the absolute likelihood is our first outing won't be perfect. But let's put it this way, with Kaizen, with this kind of attitude, the first goal, even if we think it's perfect, the idea of Kaizen is we should still be looking at it with the concept to, yes, but could it go a little further? The next at bat, the next outing I have, could it go a little further? Right? And that's what we're going to say is we're always going to be looking for a little bit further, a little bit more improved refinement, but just like mugging it, modest usable gains, Kaizen, we're improving it incrementally as we can, but I'm going to add this kind of emotional take to it and say, rather than destroying yourself, and by the way, hey, my name is Eric and I destroy myself when I don't do well. Like I get upset when I don't make it. So I'm talking to me as much as you. When we do something and it doesn't turn out the way we expect it to turn out, when we have a difficulty in learning, let's not blame the tools, but let's also not blame ourselves. We are in the process of improvement, and at our next at bat, at our next outing, we will make our improvements. And those incremental improvements are ours to make and are valuable. So Kaizen, something to look at. And if nothing else, incremental improvements, give yourself the room to grow, but plan on that growth, plan on continuing to make those gains, plan to continue on hitting those goals and improving. Other thing that was interesting, and I was kind of, hate to say this, I felt justified in something that I've always talked about, because one of the other things, Mr. Richard Greaves, who, like I said, apparently his presentation really made some impacts on me. He talked about mise en place. And yes, here we are with Eric throwing out another term that we may or may not need to know. Mise en place is a way that professional chefs prepare their area. I mean, it roughly means like everything in its place. And I actually wrote an article about mise en place some time ago, and I think people still kind of throw this thing around sometimes, but I went and put it in the links list if you want to see it. I actually called it Preparation, Focus, and Presence, and it was about how both preparing our area and preparing for our work allows us to do our work more efficiently and better, I think, but having things in place helps. And actually, the idea of mise en place was part of what Richard talked about as far as Kaizen, about improving your area, improving your presentation, improving your ability to do the work you need to do. And so I just thought when I heard him make the comment about mise en place, then define it for everybody. I had never heard anybody else but myself say this in terms of something else like this area. I actually literally heard a chef talking about it and picked it up and thought it was interesting. And I really did, I thought that was something that was worth looking at. And it's how I think about setting up embroidery machines and areas, and even to a degree, how I set up art before I do the art, how I prepare all of my resources and assets and reference material when I get ready to digitize something difficult. So, and I'll just do the drop quote that I have in here. The concept of dedicated, careful preparation and the idea of creating a space that suits each activity, even if that space is temporary, is helpful in any pursuit. So mise en place, that's another thing to think about. How are we preparing for the job at hand? How do we keep our area ready for that? When we're about ready to do a job, how do we make sure tools are within our reach, materials are within our reach, and we know what we need at any given time? It makes us able to exercise what we need to do well and have everything at hand as we need it. So mise en place was another thing that came up that I really thought was valuable. So Kaizen, incremental improvement, and mise en place, preparing yourself for the task at hand, I thought these were all useful things. One of the things I wanted to bring up briefly, a book that I thought was useful, got mentioned 3 or 4 times. Marshall Atkinson mentioned it, and then also actually Jeffrey Gittiver mentioned it. A book about creativity and the ways that we can alter ideas and come up with new ideas, called Thinker Toys by Michael Michalko. I may or may not be saying that correctly, but Thinker Toys, there is a link to it in the book, and it's not an affiliate link. I don't get anything. It's just a random Amazon link. Go get it from your library, get it from wherever. I actually got an audiobook because I had a lot of driving to do. So I'm a good chunk through it now, listening to it, but it is about the way we think and the way we attack problems. So Thinker Toys is that book. I'm going to be reading it now, and I may bring up some more about this or talk about creative problem solving and how we alter or work with ideas, some of these tools that he's discussed. But one of the ones that was very specifically discussed was called Scamper. So I did also put in, and pardon the ad from these folks, I put in a read from Mind Tools about Scamper, and this is what it is. I'm just going to go ahead and read these tools off. Scamper is a way of looking at an idea and altering it. And it's a mnemonic device to talk about these different ways we can alter an idea or a thing that we're discussing. So Scamper stands for substitute, combine, adapt, modify, put to another use, eliminate, or reverse. So let's say we're talking about an embroidery design substitute. We talked about specialty threads earlier. What if I substitute a different thread from the thread I'm currently using? What does that do to my design? Combine. If I do 2 different designs and I add them together, what does that do? If I use embroidery with digital printing, how does that look? If I combine this embroidery design with this piece of multimedia or this transfer, how does that look? If I combine these 2 kinds of threads, kind of like what we already heard Cindy talk about, if I put matte finish thread and shiny thread together, or matte finish and metallic, what kind of contrast do I get? What does that do? Combining. Adapt. Let's say I use a material for something else. What about this embroidery that I was going to use for a patch? Let's say that I put an eyelet in it, and now this patch is a key tag, or I put a buttonhole in it, and then now this patch is something that I can hang from a button on a shirt. I've adapted it to do something else. What if I wrap it in a circle and stitch it together, and it's a napkin ring now? There's all these different things we can do to adapt something we're working on. Modify. We can take a piece and change it. We take our design and modify something about it to make it different. Take one design, change something about it, and use it for something else. Put it to another use. Let's say we take our embroidery design, something I've seen the embroidery nerds do, output the DST output as vector through a software, and then we print that raw stitch data as a design on a shirt, so it looks kind of like stitching. That's putting the embroidery design to another use. We're now using it as a tool path for another design, either for print, or maybe we use it as a tool path for an engraver, and we engrave something that looks like stitches on glass. Why not? Put it to another use. Eliminate something. Let's say I take a design that has multiple colors and I eliminate all but one. What can I get out of that one color that's still there? Now I have a tonal design. Let's say I eliminate a ton of the stitches and only make an outline out of it. Let's say I take an applique and eliminate the applique and I just use it open. What does it look like? Let's say I take an embroidered garment and I eliminate one of the positions that's on it. And let's say let's say I had a left chest and a back tag, and traditionally it's a normal garment that has a left chest and back tag, but I only decorate the back tag because I eliminate the front. What does that change about the garment that I decorated or about the message that I'm sending? Let's say we reverse something. I mean, we could go right down to it and flip a design and have it literally reversed. But let's say like I just said previously, we only decorate on the back. We put our big decoration on the back and our small decoration on the front, or where we would usually put our logo on the left chest and some signifier on the sleeve. Let's say we put the signifier or the location on the left chest, but then the main logo of the company on the sleeve or on the back tag or on the shoulder, like North Face does. We could change or reverse or remix the way that we're looking at things. So Scamper is one of these tools, and it's only one of the toys in Thinker Toys where we can take a thought or an idea and modify it. So I think that was something interesting. So I put that link in there for you to take a look at. You can read that, or if you want to go check out the book from Michael Michalko. He's got other books that people really like, but Thinker Toys was recommended to me multiple times, and I thought it was useful to bring that up. So like I said, just so many cool things going on at these sessions. It's super hard to encapsulate it all. Like I said, I got to meet so many people, and if I didn't mention you by name, it's not for lack of really enjoying the time that we had to talk. Some folks is because we talked about stuff I'm not going to repeat, because we all talk shop, and I'll be honest, we bitch and we complain and we talk about the bad things as well as the good. We get through all the hard stuff and commiserate with each other, and then we talk about the ideas for how we're going to go forward. And it was incredibly valuable time. Some of the topics that we talked about today will certainly be full episodes of the show sometime. I'm going to veer back off. I'm going to take a dog leg back over to technical embroidery and digitizing stuff and creative digitizing stuff next week. However, I couldn't help but give you guys a little taste of the stuff that was going on out there. And really, if I really wanted to boil it all down, I think there's a few things I would call out. Number one, that we were all talking about providing value. No matter what you're doing, whether it's artistic, whether it is in business, all of us are looking to provide value. And those of us who are embroiderers are trying to both fight for and elicit, to develop and to communicate to the people we're showing our embroidery, or that we are selling our embroidery or giving our embroidery, what its unique value is. And it's something I think you should think about. It's a question that I left all the people at the stage. When I was standing on the stage, I left everybody in the audience with this question. And I gave them some answers that I think might be helpful to them. But it's a question I'd like you to think about: is why embroidery? Why is embroidery the right use for the thing that you want to express or create? What about embroidery is unique and makes it valuable and makes it a desirable thing for you or for your expression or for your customer? And to say, why you? What is it about the way that you came to this, the other culture that is part of you, the other things you are interested in, the mindset you bring to things, that makes you the right person to provide that to the world, to the viewer, to your customer, to your audience? Think about those things, the unique value you provide, and also give yourself some space. Give yourself some space, not only because I know you have value right now. I don't have to know which one of you is listening or when. I know that you have value to bring, and you have something to offer that all of us would benefit from. Think about that and give yourself some space to work with it. Give yourself some space to imagine what that value is and defend it for yourself. You have value no matter what stage you're at, and your work has value no matter what stage you're at, because you come from a unique background that only you can bring to bear. What is it that you can bring that is interesting, that is part of this value for all of us? Think about that. Think about embroidery. Think about providing value. But remember, incremental improvement. We have time to do this. We have the time we have, and we ought to just make the improvement, not get so worried about the improvement that we kill it before it ever starts. We kill the seed before it grows. So change for the better. Think about incremental improvement. Prepare things for yourself, and definitely think about the value and the feeling that embroidery brings, whether that's specialty thread embroidery or normal embroidery. And remember that it's in this coming together whether it's Impressions Fort Worth on the show floor, whether it's in a session with Jeff and me at the front telling you about our embroidery hardships and learning and what we can bring to bear on your problems, whether it is us and the embroidery nerds getting together and doing 2 hours of live talk and just being friends, or it's times at the lunch tables after the show talking about what we learned and how we all survived, or it's standing in front of people at a stage. We all have something to offer. We all have something to bring that is of value to each other. And it's in this coming together, in this sharing, and in this understanding of what our value is and what we can bring forward that we can make more of what we do and of ourselves. So with that, folks, I'm going to let that be way more bonus time than you need. Hopefully some of that was useful for you. Hopefully you enjoyed that. And if nothing else, there should be something to think about in all of that. And I know certainly for me, it was helpful to go through that process, to go through that experience. And despite the fact that it was a struggle to get myself through some of it, I'm happy that I could bring some manner of that value to everybody and out into a range of folks who might not have heard this message before. So thank you for helping me do that and for giving me your input and making that happen. So yeah, happy to have you guys here. Happy to have that. I'm going to put a couple more comments up right before I leave here. Mahajada says, wo wohnst du? And I would say, ich wohne aus New Mexico, or in New Mexico, New Mexico. That's where I am. New Mexico. That's where I live. But Cindy says she loves the Embroidery Nerd screen print embroidery file. Great way to modify things. Frank says thanks. Ramona says you value us. Thanks for being a spokesperson. Cindy says thanks for a great take up. And I'm just going to say once again, thank you for being here. Thank you for what you contribute. And thank you for being part of the greatest industry that I've ever been a part of. And certainly the story and the history of embroidery. Can't wait to see you guys again next week.